See you all, and this is a public mentoring session, so I'll throw it open for anyone who's got anything they want to talk about or ask about. Feel free.
Sure, I'll get it started.
Okay.
If you don't mind. One of the things, Mike, that I've gotten from you and listening to for a number of years, and especially the last intensive, I've been listening to and watching the 2019 series that you put out that's free, but one of the key parts I would assume that I've gathered, and you can comment on that, is to think governmentally, which is a whole different perspective or mindset for me. But in that process, the legislation part is interesting. I was listening this morning to I think Vision 2019, and then the third session you had the law of love. My question really is, where do we go get, receive the various other laws that you talk about that we can then act on for ourselves? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. There's several issues there. One is that which we have personally for our lives, because we all have a destiny, we have a mandate for our lives, and what do we need to help us fulfill that? And there may be some specific things that mandate, that destiny gives us, which are effectively legislative things that we can use for ourselves. And that's the jurisdiction for the use of that is for me alone, for those things that God has called me to do, independently of anything else. Now a lot of what we're called to do is actually with others. So there are some things which are corporate, depending on what corporate thing that may. Could be an ecclesia, could be a bench that are outworking a particular ministry. It could be numerous different things that God has given a group of people specific governmental authority towards. Then they would then have some legislative things which enable them to function. So the legislation really is tied to the context of whatever that mandate or blueprint is. So when we received, when I first started to do it, I didn't really think of any of that. I just was led, directed, shown what to do, and then sometimes given a mandate to do some things. I never really thought about the jurisdiction or the context at that point. I was just, okay, you've told me to go and do this, I'll do it. And back in 2016, he asked me to legislate and make time for that during that year. And I spent a lot of time engaging, either receiving legislation, making legislation, using legislation. And there are three different things that go with it, and sometimes God gives you something that says, here's some power, authorization that you now can use. And that could be individual or corporate. Sometimes I look at what he's called me to do and I think, I can't do that. And I think, how do I do that? And then I realize that although he's told me I can do it, everything isn't in place that enables me to do it from a governmental position. And the same thing would apply to any government of a nation. They may well be a law that has been produced, but then there's a whole system of how that law is then going to be put into place, right down to if it's a prohibition, who is going to stop it, and what is the consequence of not fulfilling this law. Or if it's a permissive thing, okay, when someone does this, how is this going to affect everything else? Because saying, let's say, okay, let's say, I don't want to be controversial. Yes, I do. But let's say suddenly the US government decided that it was going to use your tax dollars to give free health care, which is what we have. And we pay for it for our taxes. And it's free at the point of contact. It isn't based on insurances. There is nothing. It's just free. Now, obviously, let's say that law is passed. That's going to make no difference if there isn't the health hospitals who are going to deliver that, and they know that they have to deliver it, and they can't turn people away because they haven't got enough money or they don't have the right insurance. All of those things have to be put in place for the whole system to work. And you can make a law, but without all the things in place, the law really has no power to function, because it's only a piece of paper that says, this is now the law. So when the law gets passed, it has to go through various systems of government that then facilitate that actually working. So God gives me a mandate. I look at it and I think, not only do I not know how to do this, but I don't think I have any idea of how this is going to work in practice. So then I look at, well, what do I need? What do I need to fulfill this mandate that God's given me? So then if I'm lacking something, I would go to wisdom, or might just ask the Father directly, or go to one of the courts. The courts of the councils of the Father is one I go to when I want some clarification over legislative things. And they might say, okay, yeah, you need this, this, and this. Or I might go and say, do I have permission to go and establish this, because I need this to fulfill this mandate? And then I'll go and do it. So then I'll go to the court kings and I'll produce some legislation. And what we then did, we then pulled all that legislation together into a statute book, which is like any nation will have a statute book which says, here are all the laws that are on the statutes. And some of our laws in our country go back to like 1630 or something, and they're totally ridiculous laws. No one ever removed them from the statutes. Like, you can't drive geese up the middle of the street. I mean, there literally are some laws that still actually are on the statutes, which are totally obsolete, but no one thought to get rid of them. Technically, people aren't really got too many geese today, so it really doesn't matter too much. But if they did drive the geese up the high street and caused an accident, actually there is a law that says that's illegal. So there are things that we produced as a statute book, and they had three sort of basic sections, really. The personal laws that everyone can apply to their own lives, the laws which are specifically for an area of jurisdiction, which might be our local ecclesia, and then there's the general laws which were produced for the Joshua generation, a wider sphere. And people then can use those laws if they applies to them. And so initially a lot of the things I produced were at the time specific to the Joshua generation, and seeing that come out of the wilderness, or free from religious restrictions and all those things. So the law of religious restriction, removing of restrictions was one of the first ones I did. And of course, God in his infinite wisdom chose to use that and apply it to me. I wasn't really thinking of me when I made that law. I was thinking of all the other people who needed religious restrictions removing from them. Didn't think I had any. But of course, God then said, ha, make these declarations. Who's that going to apply for first? You. So then I went, that was the precursor to then him deconstructing my religious things that I didn't even know I had. So he deconstructed my mind from a lot of religious things on a result of getting me to start declaring and decreeing a law, which he then said, right, this is going to apply to you. So, in a sense, I think I'm not sure whether the whole statute book is available somewhere in the Engaging God program, in the useful documents. Possibly it could be in the legislative documents. But if it isn't, I could put it in there. I have made it available to all the ambassadors groups that I'm working with, simply because you know, I would rather people have a basis of something to use, um, even if some of it you have to look at it and say, well, how would that apply to my particular circumstance? You know, I can't just use it in a sort of carte blanche way. I need to look and say, okay, yeah, this needs adapting to my situation or our situation or this dynamic. But a lot of the Joshua generation ones can be used pretty much as they are, but they carry no authority unless they're part of you. Unless you take them and they become part of you, they then motivate. When you start doing things legislatively, you start from your spirit doing it, not just, well, I've got this law, I'm going to make up these things because I've got this law. When it's part of you and it empowers you, you find that when you start decreeing and declaring into situations, that inspires what you say. You know, I never use a law and sit down with it and think, okay, what am I going to do? That law is part of me, and I just legislate. So sometimes when I legislate, and obviously in the 2019 thing, there are quite a few things where I make declarations and decrees based on some of the things God said. Um, and but those declarations were made up of multiple laws that I carry. God said something. In most of those instances, I didn't need to go and get something specific to actually fulfill that. I already had it. So, and I would have probably used quite a number, not used in I'm deliberately using, but actually as I decree it, they're coming from the authority that various laws give me in that situation. And therefore they just come out, and I just journal whatever comes out and record it. You know, and I don't even think about what I'm saying at the time. I just say it, you know. But in recording it, then I look back and think, okay, I could say, well, this is where this came from. This is this authority to say this came here. That authority to say that came over here. No one else would really understand that because they don't know all the laws that I carry. So, you know, but the declarations are still valid. And depending on what you're declaring into, and it may be a ongoing thing or it may be a seasonal thing. God may say, yeah, I make this declaration, so that is for this season. Or it could be, no, this is going to continue because this is going to continue until it's done what it needs to do. So there's sort of sometimes time limits on legislation and sometimes it's open-ended. But, you know, for me, it always is associated with God saying something to me or inspiring me or calling me to do something, that then I use the legislation to outwork it. You know, I don't just think, oh, great, it would be nice to do some legislation today. Something motivates me and moves me towards it, you know, because some days I don't do any legislation like that. I'm always legislating about my own life from a place of, I have an expectation of the blessing and favor of God and the ability to do everything I'm called to do every day, which is my philosophy of life, really. And I live out of that expectation. But sometimes, yeah, I do specific things in that line. I don't know if that sort of covers what you were looking for.
Yeah, that's great. Very, very helpful. Thank you, Mike. If the placing of the statutes that you talked about, and I've heard you mention it before, in the engaging God material, that would be helpful. If that's
I'll do that. I will stick the PDF of our latest version of it, which is I think November or December last year, and so people can look at it. But again, as I say, you know, don't just take it and think, oh, I'm just going to parrot these things or say these things. Most of a law or a piece of legislation is different from the declarations, decrees that you do as a result of it. You know, sometimes I would send angels to go and do things because of this law or that law. You know, particularly when it comes to the law of love or other things, particularly one of the laws for removal of religious restrictions, I'm always sending angels with bombs of revelation, or love bombs, or lightning bolts of revelation, hey, to break in. Because I take the whole thing of, one of the laws says you have the authority to call for Emmaus Road encounters for people that I target. So that means I can call angels to go and engage with people to bring that level of, whoa, their whole world has been turned upside down by an encounter with an angel or God or whatever, but in view of just totally revolutionizing how they see something and understand something and know something because of that encounter. I've obviously had those encounters myself, so I'm aware of how powerful they are when all of a sudden you get such a encounter that everything is changed. Nothing can stay the same. Everything has to look different, and does. And then you're sort of like, whoa, how does this affect my life? Because it has to. Otherwise, it's just words.
What you're saying, Mike, too, is that in that specific example of what you call the love bombs and the lightning bolts, that's a situation where you are used specifically pinpointing someone that you've been directed to pinpoint.
Yes, I mean, that would be people within my jurisdiction. So that might be people in my family. It could be people in the ecclesia, people within the Joshua generation, or it could be God gives me direction to do that for a nation or a city. That will be determined by, specific mandates for that, or in a movement. I felt, and I'm not sure I intended to leave it in the 2019 thing, but in one of the sessions, I directed it towards a movement of people that is well known. And that came out of because I knew God was doing something within that movement, and I was aware of it, and I felt God say, hey, get behind it. Challenge, and I did, and so that was very clearly God said to do that. I wouldn't presume to do that just because, I have an issue with that group, I want them to change, or whatever. It would really have to be for that type of thing. But within my own family, I can legislate for my children coming into truth or revelation, because they're already within my sphere of influence to bring blessing to them. The same thing would really apply, as being part of an ecclesia or whatever. If you have a foundational governmental role, then you have permission to bless people. Now, sometimes the best way of blessing people is to challenge them with some truth, because that's going to change them more than anything else. So they might not feel quite as blessed at the time, but eventually they will, because they'll realize, wow, this has set me free. But the process in the middle of, whoa, what is this? Do I believe this? This is going to change me? Everyone has to go through, because the change that comes from legislation is really an outworking of that. So when God did this to me, it was, well, I couldn't see things the same way. I couldn't see people the same way. My attitude towards people had to change when I realized how much he loved them. No, I knew he loved them before, but when he showed me, demonstrated, and gave me an experience of how much he loved people, it changed me, rather than just the knowledge of it. Because I had an intellectual knowledge of the fact that I know God loves everybody, and I knew he loved me, but I didn't really encounter the depth of that love until I had an experience where he revealed that, and then everything changed, and which has then also helped in changing my understanding of how God deals with people, treats people, and all of the things that go with what love really is, and the sort of the unconditional nature of God's love, rather than the conditional nature that we have made it into, because we've made it legalistic, and well, God will love you if. No, God loves you anyway, irrespective of any ifs or buts. He loves you. You may not know that, and most people don't know it, but people don't change God, who's love. God is always love, but we have adopted systems which I think some of it is because of the law. I think we all believe that we don't live under law, we live under grace, but what does that actually mean in practice? Well, I discovered that in my journey through this, that what the things I thought was grace were actually legalistic to me and effective, and I didn't realize it. But then that meant I was trying to do certain things because I thought they were the right things to do, rather than being empowered to live that way. Not because I was trying, because grace actually is God's empowerment. It's his divine enabling ability to do something. It's not an excuse for doing something. It's like, I'm empowering you to live this way. And so I think the classic one that God really got me on, and I was talking to him one day and he said, oh, what about this verse? What do you think of this verse? And, it was the verse where Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And I thought, well, that's a really good verse. That's that. I want to live by that verse. So he said, well, where does that verse come from? I said, well, Deuteronomy. Yeah. Okay. So who was Jesus talking to when he was talking about that verse? Oh, the people who were listening. Who were they? Well, the Jews at the time who were living there, living under the law, because the law was still in force. So he said, do you think that verse still applies to you? Now I've got used to God's conversation, so now I realize I'm being got, so I realize he's going to get me. So I sort of think, so I don't answer. Then he pushes it. So I have to be honest. Well, yes, I think that verse has applied to me. He said, well, are you under the law? No. Well, why do you think that verse applies to you? Well, because it's a good thing. He said, I didn't ask you whether it was a good thing. I said, are you actually thinking you need to do that? Yeah. So then I got the point. That was a good thing. I'm going to try and do this. Well, if I'm going to try and do it because I think it's a good thing, then I'm operating in my own strength trying to do it, which really just means I was operating because it's a law, And so God really, then he said, well, if you didn't do that, what difference do you think it would make? So, and now I've got the point. So, okay. So ultimately, if I don't love you, boils down to then you won't love me, because that's the implication of the law. Is there's you do this and I'll do that. So if I don't do this, well, you won't do that. And that's what we get trapped into as believers, not realizing that there's a whole pervasive sense that the law has actually infiltrated into what we do, and we're not aware of it because we don't take the context of what Jesus said most of the time. We just think everything he said applies to me, full stop, and therefore that means me. And what the Father was really saying is, you need to be more discerning to be aware of these issues and how people are affected by them. And so I then did a check on, well, what other things do I think Jesus said to me that actually he wasn't actually saying to me at all? Now, in reality, Jesus did say, a new commandment I give unto you. But the difference between you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and a new commandment I give unto you is love one another as I've loved you. So now the motive and the empowerment to be able to love others and to love God is because he loved me. And I've experienced his love. Now I'm empowered by that experience. So, I think John was obviously called the apostle of love. He had his whole gospel is a sort of a completely different way of presenting what the other three gospels did, or presenting material which isn't in the other three gospels at all, in a way, because I think he was coming out of the heart of God, talking to us, not talking just to the people of the day and helping them understand what was going on. And it was very much sort of, this was not just for them, this was for the disciples and all who would become disciples through their discipleship and everyone else's all the way through history, which applies, hey, love one another. But now, in the epistles, I think John's epistle basically says, we love because he first loved us. Now, that's a totally different thing. That is in being inspired, motivated, empowered by being loved, not trying to love because it's the right thing to do, which actually becomes an obligation, which eventually becomes legalism, and then it gets outworked through our lives, So I think in that nature, I had to do a check on going through all my red letter things of what Jesus said, and does this apply to me? Is the principle true? Yes. Does it actually apply to me the way it's defined? No, not always. But actually, when it comes to John's gospel, yeah, virtually everything applies to me, but it's all come out of relationship and not come out of obligation or legalism. And I think that really challenged how much that potentially we can be thinking we're operating in this new covenant of grace, and really still be operating under the old covenant. And I think Jesus warned the disciples of the infiltration of the leaven of Herod and the Pharisees. And of course, the Pharisees was essentially a legalistic leaven that would infiltrate the church, and it did, and still does, and we need to not operate under the religious leaven or spirit or whatever it might be that's motivating us or can do, and be open for him to show us what is really how we live inspired by love, which is really the key to it all. So, yeah.
Well, that's a great example of what I think the shift that I feel and sense in your speaking and talking over the last several years, and that's a great example. Thank you for bringing that up. It's very, very, very clear. Thank you for that.
Yeah, it was, it was quite a difficult process, because all of a sudden you realize, oh, here's another whole area that I just had never really seen that way, until he speaks to you and starts to get you to understand what he's trying to show you. Now, if he tried to show me that 5 years ago, I would have probably just been unable to actually accept that or to receive it, because I hadn't received or experienced love in the way that I've experienced it now, which then totally changes, because I want to love God with everything I've got, because I know he loves me, and I just want to respond. Freely I've received, freely I want to give. So I want to love each other. It's not like, and my then view to the people who are not as easy to love as others, because there are some people who might be like that, who you find it not quite as easy to love as others, then I know that the power to love them is based on, I am unconditionally loved by God, and I've got no right to refuse unconditional love to others, because it's not based on their performance. Because God does not love me based on my performance. So my reaction to other people cannot come from their performance, whether good performance or bad performance. But that requires a real shift, because that's what we do. We make judgments all the time based on what we think people deserve or don't deserve. And mostly it's based on what they've done, usually what they've done to us. So if they've done something nice to us, we really would like to reciprocate and do something nice to them. But Jesus really challenged that it's okay. It's not an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And that is in the positive as well as the negative. You don't have to do this in a positive way out of law. Now it's like, love your enemies and bless them, forgive them, all that stuff then becomes, this is what it means to love. It's like, as Jesus did on the cross, Father, forgive them. Now, most people will forgive people when people ask them to forgive them. And most people will say, well, I'm waiting for them to ask, because they need to say they're sorry for what they've done. And that, again, twists the whole thing into a legalistic thing, even in forgiveness. And, repentance, people use that word a lot in the wrong meaning, but it's like, when someone's repented and said they're sorry, well, actually, it doesn't mean that at all. But let's use the penance thing. When they've done penance to me, then now they're worthy to be forgiven. And in reality, I'm very, very glad that God has not treated me that way, and doesn't. But again, we've created that system that says when you do penance, or when you, quote, repent, then he will forgive you. He's actually already forgiven us. How do we come into that forgiveness? We agree with him, which is what true repentance is, that I'm forgiven. So if you confess your sin, he is faithful to forgive your sin and cleanse you from all unrighteousness, has become confession of the sin rather than confession of forgiveness, which is a totally different way of looking at it, you see, because we've set up this system which is based on the need for someone to confess their sin to be forgiven. And if you look at the original construction of it and everything else, really, it actually really means if you confess, which means to agree with in that context, because our problem is, again, we understand in English confession through the Catholic system. That's really what the root of that has come out of. Well, confession means, oh, well, I need to admit that I was wrong and confess it. When actually biblical confession is a declaration of agreement. So when I confess about my sin, I'm confessing that I'm forgiven. Then I'm going to live in the forgiveness that I am confessing and not allow guilt, shame, and condemnation to come on me, which all that does is get you in another cycle of trying to make amends or do it and then falling back into it and everything else, rather than, hey, I'm agreeing with God's forgiveness, which is empowering me never to do this again, which is what I have an empowerment when I'm forgiven, which guilt, shame, and condemnation will never bring, which again is a system that we've developed within the Christian thing, which requires repentance. Now, I had to, actually say sorry to God for every time I'd done that to people, because I remember doing it when they were asking for ministry or asking to deal with this demon or demonic situation or whatever, and this, well, you need to repent, otherwise this isn't going to change. Well, if I was really meaning what it does mean, which is the truth, if you agree with God about this situation, which is the freedom that you are entitled to as a son of God, then this is going to change. It absolutely is going to change, because as a man thinks in his heart and believes, so is he. So we live in freedom when we believe in the ability to live in freedom. But I was meaning it as, God is requiring your pound of flesh here. He wants you to grovel, basically. And that was really the implication. You're not going to be forgiven unless you grovel and do penance, which was admitting this to him in that way. Now, again, that was the whole wrong system, which I had totally believed, because that's the only way I saw it. God does take you through things which just then are like, oh no, look at this. You have one thing and it's just attached to so many other things that then you really start to see. And I have gone through that process myself, and it was just like, okay, more, more transformation, renewing the mind, changing how I think, by showing me that how I think was aligned to the wrong thing, and I'd never ever considered that in that way. And I think so many believers believe that everything in the Bible is directly directed towards them, and they're not aware of the fact there is a context to a lot of what is being said, and it's not theirs. I mean, anything that's under the old covenant inherently doesn't apply when the old covenant is ended, which it has. And Hebrews is sort of the book, I think, which gives you the period of transition between here's the old system of all these things, and then eventually it sort of said, look, this has become obsolete and is fading away. And that ultimately then faded away when the whole system was removed, as Jesus said it was in AD 70. And then there was no earthly temple or in one nation, in one city. We are all the temple of the Holy Spirit, rather than, well, here's this new wineskin and this old one is still going on and still trying to infiltrate the new one all the time with the Judaizers and all the thing, trying to bring the old back in. Well, we've quite happily adopted the mediatorial system of the old leadership styles, and that's still what functions in majority of churches and things today. The pastor, the prophet, the apostle, who is the mediator, which is the old covenant system. And we've just that. Now, I saw obviously a long time ago that didn't quite right, but didn't really see the implications of how that works out in everything, in the old versus the new, and the old covenant still infiltrating the new one, and how much do we live under the old in the new? And I guess that's why it took me so long to go through, old versus new teaching, when I intended to do a couple of sessions of just, hey, here's what old is, this is what new means. And it took me 48 sessions, because God just wouldn't let it go. Because that was happening to me going through that process of renewing of my mind at the time. I just didn't realize until he took the blinders off, if you like. And it's just like, yes, think about new versus old in this and this and this and this. And I'm like, whoa, I just didn't realize how much I still thought in an old way. And it's really an old covenant way, really. That's really the difference between old and new. So there we go. Anyway, anyone else like to ask something or share something or throw anything in?
If no one else, I'll ask another question, Mike.
Okay.
You spent a lot of time years ago on the going to the court.
Yeah.
It seems as if there's been a shift in or maybe not, but you haven't necessarily mentioned that a whole lot in the last year or two. Is there any particular reason for that, or?
Let me think.
I'm not reading more into it than I mean, I know there's been
Yeah.
I can really, and I think most people can really see the shift and feel, probably more so the feel vibrationally, the shift that once the mind was deconstructed, and as you talked about, you realize that as you talked about those two verses that were talking about the love and the shift in the energy and the empowerment. I mean, you can feel it. So you spent a lot more time working, talking about that and expressing that in your messages that I've heard. So.
Yeah, I think I did obviously a whole series on the courts and looked at them from the mobile court and the actors and looking at it all from that perspective. I still use that when I need to use it in my own life, because it's still how you deal with judicial issues, that you need to remove legal rights and everything else. But I guess a lot of it, the emphasis on me using it in the transformation of our own life, is probably is because there's less of that type of transformation that's happened to me based on behaviors and things, because I've dealt with so much of that. Then it started to go into the motives of my heart, which was I had to deal with that, and the separation of soul and spirit and all that stuff was all part of the process of bringing me into a deeper revelation of who I am and everything else. So I see no less value on it. It's just it needs to be used in the right situation. And the danger is everyone formularizes stuff. So well, I'm going to go to the court. Why? Well, because that's what we do, isn't it? We do that, or something else will come up, and then we'll do that. And what I found was that just like years ago, it was all deliverance. It's a demon under every bush. Every problem you've got is a demon. Cast all these demons out. Because now, are there demons? Well, whatever that is referring to and everything else, there's a part to that. Yes, Jesus said that we can cast out demons. So yes, that's there. But we know every problem isn't that. And a lot of that just remove personal responsibility. Now, ultimately, the court system can be used like that to remove personal responsibility to change. So it's just, oh, well, I got a verdict, I'm going to change automatically. And I think a lot of people didn't know how to apply the verdict. Like, I have to use this and give me authority every day not to go down the same pathways. And then I discovered that In that, that means that the neural pathways that are connected to habitual things that I am now free from, I'm not free from unless I break those neural pathways and stick the verdict instead of the thing that triggers. So now if something in that area, I apply the verdict to a neural pathway, break the neural pathway, whatever was there that led the triggered behavior to ended up now is going to lead me to a verdict that says freedom. So my mind changed because that pathway was broken. Now, I don't think a lot of the way a lot of the courts are used is clear enough. It isn't just a new form of prayer, which is what it's being used in some circles. So it's been diluted. Just pray judicially rather than the way you used to. Well, it isn't that. If you don't go to a court, you can't just sort of like, well, I'm just doing this because I'm now praying this way, without having gone through the actual thing that happens to come under the judgment of God and be given a verdict, which brings freedom. So some people were using the courts totally wrongly. So they were taking people to the court and getting God, according to them, to judge those people and bring bad things on those people. Well, I don't know what court they were in, but they weren't in the court where Dad's there as my judge, because he ain't going to do that. But people were almost using the court thing to create their own version of justice. And for some, that is, these people are going to get their just desserts. Well, that isn't aligned with love your enemies and forgive them and pray for them and bless them. So I heard a lot of misuse of it, and I'm aware that when something gets put out there, not everyone really get it, and therefore it can be diluted and it can be used wrongly and it become a formula. So I wouldn't want people to use the courts as a formula. If I'm going to go to court, I am going to go there because either I see very clearly that there is an accusation here that needs to be dealt with, or God tells me you need to take this to court, which sometimes he will. I'm not just going to automatically respond by dealing with everything in the court, because some of it just comes to me saying, my thinking needs to change here. So he's giving me some truth. The lies are identified, like the change. I didn't go to the court to deal with the law of grace and grace issue, because the actual thing that God took me through and revealed just changed my mind. And I saw things differently. I didn't need, because it wasn't something demonic affecting me in that way. It was really the way my belief system was framed. And as soon as that belief system got challenged and the truth got revealed, it's like, oh yeah, easy as that. Now all of a sudden I can see it, whereas before I couldn't. Now, so I think, I'm not in any way sort of pulling back on the power of the courts to use the courts in that way. I'm just wanted to see it balanced with, in all the transformation process, it needs to be a relational process. And if it becomes a formulaic process, then people are just going through it, using the formula and praying these prayers or saying these things without any interaction with God in it. And for me, everything needs to be done relational. So if I'm a living sacrifice every day, hey, he's totally entitled to show me if there's anything he wants me to deal with. I don't have to go digging around trying to find something and then spend all my life going round and round in a circle and going down the plug hole all the time. I don't need to live that way. I'm totally open for him to show me. And when he does, I'll deal with it. If he doesn't show me anything, I'm not going to go trying to find it. Because being a living sacrifice for me is, search my heart, oh God. I'm open to your eyes to search me and remove and show me any hindrances that's stopping me fulfilling my sonship and whatever hindering me in anything, and I'm open for that, but I'm not going to go through a systematic process without God totally at the center of that. So when I did my gateways cleansing, I walked through the gateways with Jesus. I didn't go through a formulaic approach. I asked him, what does this gate mean? What's going on in this gate? Why does this gate look like this? Why is this gate closed? What's going on here? And then, okay, what's hindering this gateway? Show me what I've done to effectively close this gate or block it or hinder it. It was all relational. And sort of my whole transformational process was relational. But I'm aware you put out a series of teaching and then people take the teaching and then do it in a formulaic way, which wasn't the way I experienced it because I did it relationally. So it's hard to do anything linearly when you teach it, which is not a linear process. It's like all of the things that God did in bringing transformation to my life were done in an interactive way. He didn't take me through 20 steps of transformation. He just was transforming me. And in that process, I learned that these were a lot of the things that he did and showed me along the way, and so they're all tools in the toolbox to help us. But you don't pull out a hammer when you need to cut a piece of wood, and you don't pull out a saw when you need to hammer in a nail. You need the right tool for the right situation. And for me, he's the one that inspires that situation, not me. But that keeps it always relational and therefore never performance driven or orientated, which transformation can be. If you're doing it out of, well, I need to be transformed because he will do this, this, or this, then again, that's coming from a legalistic perspective rather than the relational perspective. He loves me anyway. So whether I do this or don't do this, it's not going to stop me loving it, but he wants me to do this because it's going to be for my benefit. He wants me to have a different perspective, or he wants me to be free from this. It's for my benefit. It's not going to influence how much he loves me, but it probably is going to influence how I feel in my life, which is what happens when you realize something and get changed. It's like, oh, this is great. Everything's changed in this area. So yeah, the courts are definitely something I still use. Sometimes we do corporate court cases to deal with certain issues because they're an issue that's come up. But I don't see it's the panacea for every single problem that you have.
That's a great, thanks for that great reminder and explanation. Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Anyone else? Yeah, Dave, go on, carry on.
Is my sound on? Good.
Yep.
Good. Yeah, thanks. You answered my first question I had for tonight was, or tonight with me, was around the law books and what laws are available to us. I know in one of the things I've listened on YouTube, you mentioned a law around restitution. It might be in the book. So my question really is around if the laws are there, and if you publish that on the engaging God will be great. But how do we use those laws? What would you suggest the steps are that we take, or the process that we take it through to use some of those laws? I know it's probably different in different cases.
Yeah. Well, as I said earlier, that the laws have to be part of you, in a sense. They need to be something that are you've taken into yourself to say, this law is operating in my life, and I receive it because it empowers me. I think virtually everything of all the laws that we have, they're all permissive and empowering, not prohibitive. Whereas most people, when you think of a law, think immediately of thou shalt not, rather than you can. So immediately you receive that law, and it then empowers you to say, well, I can do this. I can do that. I can do this. I'm entitled to this. I'm entitled to that. I have authorization for this. Now, just because you have that doesn't mean it's automatically going to happen. You then have to apply it. So then let's say, let's say the law of restitution or whatever. I am entitled to the restitution of this, this, and this. If something has been stolen, robbed, or whatever, I can't remember what the law says, but that's the sort of the implication of what restitution is. Okay, so I'm entitled. So what am I going to do to apply it? Well, I'm going to start looking at what I've been robbed in, areas I might be entitled to something. Then I'm going to make declarations and decrees in accordance to that law. So I'm going to decree the restoration of this to me. I'm going to send an angel out perhaps to bring something to me that's been stolen from me in any particular way. So then I really have to use it to legislate, because legislating is different from legislation. Legislation is what you then use to legislate. And so I have to do something to facilitate that. It's not an automatic process. We use it and then we then see it applied. And depending on what the law is, some of it is not necessarily always affecting me. It can be, I am authorized to affect other people using this law. It's obviously going to bring them into blessing. But the way that outworks may be very different for every individual that is affected by the declaration that I make. I don't know what it's going to take for every individual for their minds to be renewed or for their minds to be deconstructed. But I'm going to start to create an atmosphere that facilitates deconstruction or renewing of the mind by declaring things, calling things out, sending angels out with, revelation, or any amount of things you can do as a result of now you're empowered. So I, from my position of authority where I'm seated, I then exercise that authority every day. And some days my focus will be in one area, some days my focus will be in another area, some days they're in several areas, some days it's like, hey, rest. You don't need to do anything. But because I'm living from a place of rest and my spirit is continually in the realms of heaven, even though I might not be doing consciously or cognitively anything, doesn't mean that things aren't done. I'm always seated in heavenly places, whether I'm consciously there doing something or not there doing something consciously, but still they're doing it. So essentially I'm living out of heaven's blessing, which are all those laws in operation for my life. But when I then direct it towards others, it's usually done very specifically in an area that God either shows me or I'm inspired to respond. And sometimes I just get moved by things. It's just like, yeah, I need to do something about this. Now I wouldn't do it if it's outside of my jurisdiction. And sometimes I ask God, do I have any authority to do anything about this? Because I'm moved generally by looking and seeing people's lives being messed up or something's happening wrong and I don't want that to happen. Then I go to God and say, do I have any power, any authority to do this? And sometimes if I really feel strong, I say, can I have some? Can I have a mandate to deal with this? Because I'm just fed up with this going on, So it's just like, and he'll say yes or he'll say no. And if he says no, I have to then say, okay, this is not my responsibility to deal with this. But in general, I am an ambassador towards certain things, one of them being the Joshua generation. Therefore, I am always going to be stirred by that role because it's an ongoing role. And so those things stir me more than other things in my life. Other things stir me when they impact me. I'm always impacted by the fact that not enough people are out of the wilderness and living in their inheritance in heaven. So I'm always, that's always something that's moving me. So that's why a lot of my declarations will be around that in some way, because that's a role that I have and a mandate that I carry, and it's something which really I'm passionate about. The other day, I was engaging with one of these ambassadors groups, and we were engaging for a mandate, and I was looking at the mandate, and I was looking through the eyes of the ox in the four faces of God. And so I'm looking through the eyes of the ox, and I just wondered, what's the oracles of God here? What's the heart of God? What's his word in this, which I really can receive? And so I'm looking at through the eyes of I was just looking at this mandate, wanting really a sort of clarification and really the heart behind it. I wanted God's heart behind it. And wisdom came and she stood in front of me and she said, oh, and she said, let me open my heart to you and let me show you the oracles of the Father, the oracles of God. So I thought, oh, great. So she opened her heart and I saw 4 or 5 things, or I knew 4 or 5 things from what she unveiled about this is the oracles of the Father's heart. And the first one was passion. So it was passion. Then it was burning desire. And then it was deep, intense intimacy, intense joy. And then it was deep compassion and then overwhelming love. So there was these 5 or 6 things. And now it's like, when she said that and when I felt it, I was just, really challenged by that, but also empowered by it. And then she said, if you are motivated by the oracles of the Father's heart, you will always operate in love. So I thought, wow, yeah, that's really cool. So, I need passion. I need joy, intense joy. I need deep compassion. I need overwhelming love, and I need a burning desire. Those were the things. So if I don't have those things, then I'm going to be pretty sort of lukewarm, really. And I might be doing something, but I'm not really inspired or motivated. But when I know the heart of God towards something, which is what Jesus knew every day, that's what empowered him to only do what he saw the Father doing, because he knew his heart. He then operated out of those things. He operated out of passion. And I think, you can see from Jesus' life that he was a passionate guy. He operated out of burning desire. He so desired to do the Father's heart, outwork the Father's will. I've only come to do the will of him who sent me. Everything about his attitude was motivated by that. You can see he was a man moved with compassion, and obviously operating in overwhelming love, so it was like, but that just came in this encounter, which again, just was like, that changes how I see doing things, and if I'm not coming out of the Father's heart, then those things aren't going to function, and I'm going to possibly doing stuff out of duty or obligation or need, because, well, there's a need, so someone needs to do it, and all those things will probably be not very effective and will probably mean me doing something that I'm not really empowered to do. Whereas if I'm coming out of the oracles of the Father's heart and carrying that sense of his heart, it's going to inspire me in a completely different way. So a little encounter like that, again, I'll meditate on that encounter, and that encounter will be something which is really working in me to outwork that. What does it mean to have passion? Because it's a word. What does the word mean? Well, actually, the word in Greek actually means the same thing as wrath. It's like, people translate it wrath because they attribute wrath to God, but actually, the word in root means passion. So, whoa, that's I need to be passionate, and then, burning with desire. Well, I know how to create desire. So if I'm going to be burning with desire, it really is going to be a motivation in my heart, which then outworks all the rest of them in a way which actually enables me to outwork the heart of God. So yeah, using the laws really is down to actually using the authority that they give you in a legislative way towards your life or towards others in the way that you're mandated to do. That's the key. So, if you look at our statute book, don't just take those things and think, oh, I can just, flip these things out really easily. You need to be passionate about them. You need to really have them It's like, I know I am authorized in this. This empowers me. I am going to use it because I'm empowered. And that takes the formula out of it. And if you formularize them, there's no real power at all. The same thing with communion prayers and all the declarations I make. They're my declarations that work for me because they birthed out of me. I wouldn't encourage anyone to parrot fashion use them without making them their own and developing their own language and use them relationally with God the way they would. Otherwise, it just becomes an exercise. I'll go through this ritual, and we tend to default to ritual and to methods and formula because it's easy without having a relationship. Well, I'll just do this. But the relationship is really what's the power behind everything. The inspiration, the motivation comes out of that relationship. And that's when you will find it so easy to be perseverant and diligent and persistent with something, which most people struggle with, because it's not coming out of the empowerment of that relationship. Therefore, how many people do New Year's resolutions? It's just like, oh yeah, I'm going to change. I'm going to do this. And within a few days, the enthusiasm has waned, and I think, it's very different when you are motivated by the Father's heart. So, yeah. Okay. All right. Anyone else? I've got time for one more. Okay, we're all struck dumb with things, and are all going to go back and look at where you're operating under the law. I'm sure, because it's would be a good thing to do. Just ask God, hey, can you show me where I have thought some of the things Jesus might have said, apply to me, and they don't necessarily apply to me the way I have had them applied, which would be to create almost like you need to do this performance. God really doesn't want a performance. He just wants a relationship, and that's the awesome bit about it. All right. Okay. All right. Well, I'll leave it there, and